Hello, I am Susie Peace, and I am here at the DeLand House Museum in DeLand, Florida. It is Friday, September 1st, 2017, and I am honored to be interviewing a very interesting and wonderful woman by the name of Sally Neider.
Thank you.
So, Sally, where were you born and when?
I was born March 11th, 1937 in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
And how many children were in your family?
5.
And what was the pecking order?
I'm the oldest, can't you tell? I have 2 sisters younger than me and 2 brothers younger than me.
What were their names? Or what
Sally,
are their names?
Susie, Sandy, Dan, and David. My parents were hung on those initials.
Right, and you had a couple of Anns in there, didn't you?
I'm Sally Ann. My sister was Suzanne, all in one name. She didn't have a middle name. And then there was Sandra, who had my mother's middle name, which was Louise, and she hates it to this day. And then there was Dan, who my father was Willard Dan, and so my brother was the same, but we've always called him Dan. And then my other brother was David, and he has a middle name of Wentworth, which is a family name in our family. But and I was known all the way through school as Sal. I don't know why, but I'm Sally now.
What's the origin of your name, Neider?
It's German. Yeah. My grandmother was from Germany, so was her husband. They immigrated to the United States when they were real young children, and they didn't come through Ellis Island. They went direct to Michigan, to a little town called Holland, because they were from the German-Dutch border. And so they were raised in Holland until they moved into Grand Rapids.
Wow, interesting. Have you been married?
No.
And children?
No.
No, but you have a lot of children in your life.
Lots of children.
Which we'll hear about.
Lots.
How old were you when you moved to West Volusia County in Florida?
I was 11.
Okay, and why did your family move here?
My aunt wintered in Sanford. Her husband was a railroad engineer, and that was the end of the railroad from Michigan at the time. And they had a winter home in Sanford, and they invited my Aunt Marie's sister, my grandmother, Matilda, to come and visit. And she came home so excited about Florida. I can see it today, standing in our kitchen. Bill, you have to see Florida. It's so beautiful. We saw Florida.
So when did your parents actually come down?
They came down about a month later to look at Florida. And my dad they were driving to New Smyrna Beach, and they stopped at this little building on the highway in DeBary. It wasn't DeBary, it was a wide spot in the road, halfway between Orange City and the bridge. And he went in and talked to them, and they offered him a job. And he took it. It was to put in the road system in what is Plantation Estates, now part of DeBary. And they came home and gathered us up.
And did you like Florida when you moved here?
No, I hated Florida. I had to leave my best friend. I loved my school. My school teachers had been teachers of my mother and my grandmother. Of course, they were older, but they were great teachers. And I cried as much over leaving my 2 best teachers.
How old were you when you moved
I was
to
11.
Florida? 11, okay. Yeah. And tell us about your best friend, what she was like.
Oh, she was just a neat person. She lived next door to us. She was, her parents were Native American and black, and she was just my best friend from kindergarten on.
Okay, and what was her name?
Vyra.
Vyra. Where did you live first when you moved to DeBary, or to the area called DeBary?
Well, we lived in Paola for a little time in a rented house, but then when my dad began work for Plantation Estates, there was a big old 2-story building right down near the mansion, and the people that were running the mansion at the time, or the salesman, or I don't even know exactly who it was, told my dad that he could live in the house. So it had been the laundry house for the DeBary Hall, as they call it now, as the DeBary Hall people who did the laundry for Count DeBary. And so we moved into that house, and it's still there on the grounds of DeBary Hall.
Okay. What school or schools did you attend?
I went to Enterprise. I was in Michigan, of course, until the 6th grade. I went to Enterprise. At that time, they had the 7th and 8th grade, and then I went to DeLand High School.
Okay, and the Enterprise School that you attended is now the Heritage Museum.
Center, Historical Museum, whatever they call it. Yep. In fact, when I gave my talk on the Ox Fiber Brush Company, I was standing in my classroom.
Yeah, remember that.
The classroom I threw Nancy Brown out the window.
You tell us about that story. That was one of my favorites.
It was a little pest who kept annoying me. And she said, at that time the desks were connected, and she was always banging on the back of my desk, and she would kick me, and she just was unpleasant. But she was standing up by the side and annoying me, and at the side of the wall, we were the last row facing this way, and this was a row of windows. And at that time, we didn't have screens on the window, and she was leaning on the window, and I pushed her, and she went out the window. But we were on the 2nd floor. So that made it a little bad, but she landed in the hedge and got up and shook herself off and came running around to the front door and back upstairs.
And she was
She lived at the Methodist Children's Home.
Right. And you had a lot of experience with children that lived at the Methodist Children's Home. You had a lot of, you said they'd come over and visit your family.
Because most of them didn't have family nearby. I never quite understood. They had no orphans at the Methodist Children's Home. There was not an orphan there. They all had parents somewhere. But I guess back in that time, if the mother got the child, it was hard to take care of her. I mean, what were they doing, earning as a living? So most of the kids that I knew had parents and would see them once or twice a year. But I became very close to them, and they came around to our house all the time. Do you want to hear about my 16th birthday with those kids?
I'd love to.
There was a pool at DeBary Hall, DeBary Mansion, and my dad had rehabbed it. It was a sulfur spring pool with a free-flowing spring into it. And he would drain the pool, and then we would have to clean the muck off the sides. Something about sulfur water, there's green muck that grows on the side of the pool. So we'd scrub the whole pool down, and he'd clean it out at the bottom and then fill it up. Well, the kids from the Methodist Children's Home and my friends in Enterprise used to love coming over because the only thing we had for entertainment was the pool. And I had my 16th birthday there. And I occasionally run into one or two of the people that was at my birthday party. Frank Knight, who's a local kid from Enterprise. And
it was very deep.
Yeah,
the pool was very
deep sides.
It was a swimming pool.
It was a swimming pool. You swam it. That's where all of us learned to swim.
Yeah.
And it's where I had that great birthday party. And the highlight...
Tell them how your dad taught you to swim.
I must have told you something about it. Anyway, he did. I can't remember what I told you. Isn't that sad?
That if you were going to be in there, you had to swim.
Oh, yeah. True. I mean, he wasn't going to let us go. We never could go there alone.
Right.
And he wasn't going to let us go unless we learned to swim.
Yeah.
And so...
That's it.
When
did the school year begin?
Oh, Monday after, the day after Labor Day.
Okay.
We didn't have to go to school in August.
Right. When did the school year end?
It ended, I think it was Memorial Day weekend, either just before it, but we were never in school for Memorial Day, and we were not in school for Labor Day.
And how would you get to school?
A bus. Serena Fender, right down at the foot of the hill in DeBary was where she lived, and she had, I think, 4 daughters of her own, all in school with us, and she was the bus driver. And I have a picture somewhere of her driving up in front of our house, and my dad wanted to take a picture. It was our first day at school, and all 5 of us are lined up there, and he took the picture with Miss Fender smiling in the bus driver's seat.
And what about lunch at school? What was that like? Did you bring your lunch, or
we had a lunchroom. It was a little tiny frame building at the back of the school all by itself. It had been a cottage at one time, and they turned it into a lunchroom. And we had things I'd never had before, a lot of Southern food. And I thought it was great food. I never complained.
And what high school did you attend?
I went to DeLand High School right here in DeLand.
And where was it at that time?
Right up the street from you folks.
Okay, so now it's the school board offices up here on Clara. Did you belong to any clubs in high school?
Not many. I belonged to the something that was called the GAA, the Girls Athletic Association, and we played a lot of everything: field hockey, basketball, softball, swimming. We used to go to DeLeon Springs for swimming lessons.
Wow. So you would do this after school?
No, this was a school during our PE program, and then on Saturdays, the Girls Athletic Association, that was a group from school that were involved in sports, would play other towns in the county. We never went out of the county, but we played New Smyrna Beach and Daytona.
Great. Did you attend college?
I started at Stetson, but I did not finish.
What were you studying at Stetson?
Education.
Education, okay. And let's tell us about your dad. I know you told us about your 16th birthday at the DeBary Mansion or Hall pool.
Yeah.
And but he was a great dad. You tell us about his demeanor. You were describing him. How
As I got older, I felt sorry for him because he was such a mild-mannered man. And he had 3 aggressive daughters and 2 mild-mannered sons. Somehow the thing got reversed, but he was a great dad. He just was there for us all the time. We had lost our mother when I was probably 14 years old. I guess I shouldn't say I lost her. She moved away. 5 kids was too much, I suppose.
Yeah. And what did your dad do for a living? You mentioned that he built roads.
In the beginning, he put in the road system in DeBary and in Plantation Estates. And when you talk about roads, it was shell from New Smyrna Beach. They trucked the shell over, and he worked for a company. 2 guys here in DeLand, twin brothers, started the company, and they hired him right away. And he designed the road system and put it in. And they were both, mostly because it was just sand, they were shell-based in the beginning. And they would grind the shell and make a road out of it.
Okay. And what are some fun activities? Your dad did a lot of family activities with you and your brothers and sisters.
Well, in the summertime, we were always at the pool. We were probably at the pool every single day that he would let us go. But we did a lot of Sunday drives, get in the car and go for a drive, and we usually packed a lunch, and we went every place around here that you could go. I remember going as far as Alexander Springs, that way, San Lando Springs, which was, we always found some place to swim because we were all good swimmers and loved the water. So every place there was a spring. And then he was always teaching us about the spring system in Florida. And I learned very early that if you look at a Florida map and you start at Alexander Springs and you come all the way down to Tampa, it's a fault line. And most of the springs are on that line. And you go through Alexander and DeLeon and Blue Springs and San Lando Springs and right on down the line. Rock Springs, they all are attached to that fault line.
Interesting.
He liked to teach.
Just like you.
I guess, maybe so. I never thought about that.
Well, tell us about Gemini Springs.
Well, Gemini Springs was just kind of an overgrown little spring, and it was, I'm not sure if it was owned by the Paget family. No, I think Mr. Paget was a caretaker for Count DeBary, and that was the caretaker's house down there on the lake. It's sort of in a little slough that comes off of the lake that has springs in it, and there's a spring right next to the house. And the Pagets lived there at the time. The 2 boys are a little bit older than I am, but I've still kept in touch with them. In fact, one married a really good friend of mine. And so we swam in that all the time. We just ride our bikes down there. I guess it was the highlight of our summer because there wasn't much else to do. So we swam there. We swam in Green Springs and Enterprise. And I thought it was so big. I learned to swim across that. And now I go back there and I look, I said, that's not much bigger than a swimming pool.
All right. Well, tell us about the DeBary Mansion, as you call it. Now, of course, it's DeBary Hall, but who lived there? What happened to Count DeBary and his family, and who took it over after that? And the Thanksgiving that you attended there?
It was Count DeBary's summer home, or winter home, I guess you would say. And he spent his winters here. He had one daughter. He passed away while he was in Florida, and however they notified people, his daughter and her husband, no children, were on their way to Florida, and they were killed in an automobile accident. And so there were no more any DeBary heirs. A group of attorneys in DeLand somehow were the ones that administered the will or whatever, and they were going to sell the property. But then a couple of guys from New York, the only one I can remember his name was Salvador DeLucian, and he was the head salesman. And that's how DeBary started. He was selling lots to people in mostly New York and New Jersey. And they'd bring them down on the train, pick them up. The train stop at that time was just south of DeBary on the old Benson Junction Road. And people could get on and off the train, which now it's not a stop anymore. But that back then, and then he would bring them up to the mansion, put them up, show them all the property, sell them a lot, send them back home, and build their house.
Interesting. What about your Thanksgiving dinners there?
After there were probably 6 or 8 families, we started having Thanksgiving at the DeBary Hall. And somewhere I have a picture of a stairway. Somebody's on the stairway looking right down at us, and we're sitting there. And it's all the first of the people that moved to DeBary. And the two that stand out to me in that picture, every time I see them, there were 2 unmarried, we used to my dad called them the old maids, sisters, the Genoy sisters. And they never walked out of the house, but that they didn't look like they were going to some wedding or church or whatever. They were always dressed to the teeth. And you look at them in this Thanksgiving picture, and they're all dressed right there, sitting there. My mom, everybody brought a covered dish, and my mom cooked the turkeys, and we had Thanksgiving there. With everybody who lived in what is now DeBary, it was called Plantation Estates, would come to Thanksgiving.
And let's talk about DeBary a little bit, about the town of DeBary. What was it like in the early days?
The early days wasn't DeBary. Count DeBary was the man who had the mansion, but it was called Plantation Estates. And the only development was on the, let's see, what side would that be? This is, I don't know, it's on the, as you drive down 1792, it's on the left. It started with High Banks Road, and it ended with Enterprise Road. And it went 1792, Enterprise Road, High Banks Road, and the other Enterprise Road. And that was it, right there. And the first street was DeBary Drive, which went right straight through. The little office is still right there. And it went 2 blocks. The first block, it went to, I think it was Matanzas. Mm-hmm. And it went 1 block left and 1 block right. Mm-hmm. And that was it. There wasn't anything else. There were 2 model homes. My dad was just driving through and stopped, and they offered him a job. Yeah. And we were on vacation at that time, and they offered him a job, and he took the job, and we moved. We lived in Paola for a while, and then until we moved into what we called our little house, which was on Matanzas. He put the road system in. It was shell. It was clay and shell. And they brought the shell from New Smyrna Beach, and they ground it up, and he put the bed down and put in the road system. People that now live on some of those old clay roads can thank him for that.
Well, what were the people like in DeBary at that time?
Old. It was a retirement community. It was started by Count DeBary died, and his daughter and her husband came to Florida and decided that they were going to sell it. So a group of investors in DeLand, and I can't remember their names, purchased the property, and they hired Schmeira as one of the people to sell the property. And they advertised it in New York. So that's why half the people in DeBary for the first 2 years were from New York and New Jersey. They all talked funny too. My dad was offered the job to help put the road system in. At that time, there was just DeBary Drive, and it went 1 block and turned 1 block left and right, and that was it. And so you can blame him for all those windy little trails and whatever. They went around with a stick and a hammer and just marked out where roads would go, and he plowed it through. And the roads were made of shell. They brought in crushed shell from New Smyrna Beach and paved the road with the shell because the sand was and clay and things. They were putting clay on it, but they eventually were shell until they were paved.
So you've seen DeBary develop from plantation estates into DeBary, and what?
Well, we lived in that 2-story old building that was an outbuilding of DeBary Hall. The laundry house, yeah, is what it was. And my dad remodeled it, and we lived there, and until he could build our house. And then our house was one of the first houses that we lived in a model house first on the corner of, I think it was Naranja and Estrella. It was an interesting community. They sold lots. They brought people down from New York and New Jersey, put them up in the mansion, toured them around, and they bought lots on the 2 existing streets that were there at the time. Those were the first 2 that were built up, DeBary and Naranja. And I learned when I got to high school, and you don't say Naranja, it's Naranja. But we grew up knowing it as Naranja, and we still call it Naranja. I took Spanish to learn how to say the name of my street.
You mentioned you could see the bayou from the plantation.
Oh yeah, when you go to what we call the mansion,
yeah,
it is now called DeBary Hall, but we always called it the mansion. There was a path right straight down to that little slough that comes off of Lake Monroe, and you could look right at it. It was there, and as you went down it, there was a little trail off to the left, and the old mansion pool is there. And my dad rehabbed the pool. It's a sulfur water pool filled from a flowing well. And we learned to swim in that pool. And it's a pool that has straight sides, straight down, no sloping or anything. You just have to learn to swim to be in it. Because it was we could stand on the bottom and look up and your nose was looking at the ground.
What have you seen that pool recently, or do you know what happened to it?
Yes, I have seen it recently. I drove down there, and the road was gone, and I plodded through the woods, and some of it is caved in, and they've got no trespassing signs, and they've taken the little bathhouses down, and I think it's so sad. We had so much fun in that pool. The spring is still there. It's a capped-off spring.
Yeah. So describe some early events in DeBary. I remember you telling me about a May Day celebration.
We had the May Day celebration. And most of the kids that were in DeBary were 2 to 3 to 4 years younger than I was. And so they were all the people who danced around the maypole. And I got to stand up on the back of a big flat truck and read something that somebody printed and gave me to read. We had not only May Day, but there was one other celebration that I can't remember what the name of it was. Some holiday that comes along in there in the spring. I don't know. I'd have to really pull it out of the back of my head.
Was May Day the same thing as DeBary?
Columbus Day. Columbus Day. That's what it was, because I was Miss Columbus.
That's in the fall.
That's in the fall. Well, we always had that in front of, there was a family by the name of Schmeira that lived right on the highway. And they had a huge front yard, and he always let everybody use the front yard. And I have pictures of the maypole dance, and it was a covered dish dinner out there in the yard.
And that was DeBary Day?
That was DeBary Day.
The same thing as DeBary Day.
Okay. We called it DeBary Day.
Okay. All right. Well, would you tell us about your first job? What happened to you between going to Stetson and then your well, actually, you had talk about your first job in high school at the Ox Fiber Company.
Oh, Ox Fiber.
Yes.
Yeah, Ox Fiber Brush Company. That's right. I gave you guys a talk on the Ox Fiber Brush Company.
That's right.
It was a whisk broom manufacturing plant located at the town of Benson Junction. That was a railroad stop, and we made whisk brooms. And I did the payroll, and I would come home from school early, go to, the night before I would sit down and figure out how many got quarters and dimes and nickels and pennies, and then I would have to go into the bank in Sanford. They didn't bank in DeLand. I don't know why, but I've always banked in Sanford. Sanford Atlantic National Bank, and get however many pennies, dimes, and nickels it was to pay up to 70 people. They were paid in cash. And they weren't allowed to come into the building where there were two small offices. Mine is the entranceway, and then Mr. Wright was the plant manager. They had to come to a window that was on the side of the building. And they would say to me, Miss Sally, how many deducts this week? Because we had a company store. And sometimes they would borrow money, and Mr. Wright would lend it to them. And then I would keep track of it and deduct it from their salary, weekly salary.
And most of the workers were?
They were black. They lived in community housing. There were 3 white foremen who lived up on the top of the hill, and the black people lived down below on the hill. It was really unusual for me, having grown up with a black friend as my best black person as my best friend. Mr. Wright treated them well, and if they had to go to the doctor, he made sure they went. But it was still a system that I wasn't used to, that they wouldn't be allowed to come in and get their paycheck. I had to pass it out a window to them. And the way that they lived, the thing that I just, to this day, I can see it in my mind. Twice a year, I would send out a message and say cleaning day. And what would happen, we had a fire truck. Every black person who lived in a community house, not the white men who lived at the top of the hill, would take all of their furniture and possessions out of the house and stack it outside, and the fire trucks would come down and hose out their houses. Now, they were probably as clean as you and I would keep our houses, maybe better, and yet they had to endure that. And I just thought that was the most horrible thing. Yeah. Hard to imagine today.
Yes. And that form of discrimination that you witnessed. So tell us about how you started your first business, your first career after college.
After the Ox Fiber Brush Company.
After the Ox Fiber Brush Company. Can you tell us why it was called the Ox Fiber Brush Company, and what the brushes looked like?
The brushes were made of palmetto fiber. And once they put the palmetto fiber through the system, it turned a deep, dark red. If you can think, when you say the palmetto fiber, that's the part of the palmetto that's below the fronds. Part of it is underground and part of it's above ground. But most of you, if you have an old palmetto bush and you dig it out, it's this big clumpy thing. That's the part that has the fiber in it that was made in it. And somehow in the machine, they called it a hackler, and they would toss these big buds into the hackler, and it would wind them around on knives and chop it up, and they would turn beet red, or ox fiber red, ox blood red. Yeah. And that's the fiber that they made the whisk brooms out of. In fact, ask some old DeLand people, have you got an old red whisk broom? And I'll bet they do.
I bet so too. So tell us how you transitioned into your first career.
Well, I guess my first career was, I opened a daycare in DeBary. I taught Sunday school, and there were a lot of kids. At that time, Deltona was just beginning to get started, and they had a couple of women employees, and I just decided to open a daycare. And so up on Sanford Avenue was a house that was vacant, and I rented it and started a daycare. And then eventually moved into my big building, which was down on the highway, which now, if you drive through DeBary, is a retention pond. My building went the way of the retention pond. But there was a building there, which I purchased, and then started my daycare there.
And tell us about your daycare. How many children did you have at the beginning, and how did it?
Well, I just had 4 or 5 at the beginning, but it grew so fast because the people in Deltona that were coming to work for them had kids. And more women were beginning to go to work. And we got up to, I had built a second building next door to it, and there wasn't a daycare anywhere in the area. There was one in DeLand, but that was a long way to drive your child. And then I just decided Florida didn't have kindergarten at the time that I was going to have kindergarten. So we were a daycare with a kindergarten program, and I had it for 25 years.
Wow. How many employees did you have?
We had,
toward the end of it?
I think the most I ever had was 8. That was when we were at the height of. By then, other daycares were opening. I had 2 young children from a family in Deltona, and he decided it was such a good idea, he opened one himself out on the road on the way to Osteen, right in the back of Deltona.
That's interesting. And tell us about how you ran it. You told me, but I'd like for you to share it with all these other people. How the food, the way you did your food and your nutrition and your exercise and field trips and all of that.
We could do so much more then. The county wasn't looking over my shoulder at what we were going to feed them. And I had one of my ladies who was an excellent cook that worked for me, and she did most of the meals. I planned them. And we always had a well-balanced meal. If corn on the cob was in season, we had corn on the cob. We usually had seasonal type things. We had a neighbor from where we lived who had a tangerine tree. People came to DeBary and it was mandatory. You planted a tangerine tree, an orange tree, and a grapefruit tree. Well, he had probably 3 of each, and he had more fruit than he ever knew. And he used to just bring me boxes of fruit, and those kids had unlimited fruit during the season. It was very different. You couldn't get away with that today. I mean, we sat around little tables of 6, and the kids helped set the table, and eat the food, and clear the table.
And then when you went your field trips?
Lots of field trips. I had a van. My dad called me one day and he said, "Sal, you got to come and look at this. Before that I had a station wagon. He says, I've got a van that you're gonna die for. You need it." Well, I got there and it was this big old green van. It had no windows in it. I said, "Daddy, I can't haul my kids in that." And he said, "Oh, no, I'll fix it." I said, "What do you mean fix it?" He said, "I'll put windows in it and doors and seats." So he did. He cut out the side panels, he put windows in it, and then it had a row of wooden benches all the way down one side, across the back, and down here. No seat belts, you just sat on the bench. Can you imagine hauling kids around today? And we went everywhere. In the summertime, because we had so many older kids, I would pack that van. There was probably sometimes 10, 12, 15 kids, and we went everywhere. I left the daycare to my people there. We took the older ones and went. As far as Alexander Springs, one of my experiences, I had a young boy in my daycare. He was my very first customer. His name was Vince Accardi. His grandmother started pharmacy in DeBary. And then his dad became a pharmacist, and Vince eventually did too. But Vince was a friend of my godson. And so I took them a lot of places. And one Saturday, Vince appeared, and we decided that we were going to go swimming, and we were going to go to DeLand Springs. And I said, "Call your mom." So he went off, and he said, "I'll ride my bike home and ask her." And he came back, and he said, "Yeah, she says I can go." So we got in the car, and I took Dwayne, my godson, and Vince, who were good friends, and we got to DeLand Springs, and it was full. And we couldn't get there. And I said, "Well, let's just go on up the road a little bit." So we went up to Alexander Springs, and we stayed all day. When I came back, at that time, the police department in DeBary was a constable. His name was Oscar Papineau, and he was sitting in my driveway. I thought, what is that? Well, it turns out that Vince never asked his mom if he could go. And he had been with me probably 6 to 8 hours. We had packed a lunch, we had stayed all day, we wandered home. He was in some trouble.
Okay.
He went on to become a pharmacist and got something, one of the diseases that you get, and just passed away last year. Young guy.
Well, I remember you said that the children had to make their own peanut butter sandwiches
before
they went on a field trip.
Yeah.
And made their own lunch.
Because some kids wanted jelly, some people wanted peanut butter on both sides of the bread, some people wanted it cut in diamonds. I said, "Fix it yourself." So we plunked the peanut butter and the bread on the table, and they made their sandwiches, wrapped them up, put their name on the bag, and away we went. It was a cheap lunch.
So now, how long did you have that business, and how did you start your second career?
I had that business for 25 years. And then I decided it was time to quit. By then, there was a daycare in Orange City. There was one in Deltona, one out on the Osteen Road. And competition was there. The churches were beginning to open daycares, and I just decided it was time for me to go. So I put the property up for sale and decided I was not going to do anything, I guess, for the rest of my life. How I thought I was going to live, I don't know. And that's when a friend of mine called me and she said, "Oh, Sally, guess who's quitting?" I said, "I don't know." And she gave me her name, and I said, "What are you going to do?" And she said, "I'm going to interview you for the job on Monday morning." So I went in and interviewed and went to work for Citrus Council Girl Scouts for 22 years.
Wow.
I was the property manager, and we had wonderful, wonderful sites. I'm lucky. I had 2 great jobs. I never got tired of getting up and going to work, and they were jobs that were just meant for me.
Well, tell us about that interesting house that the Girl Scouts own, these Juliet Low homes or something.
Well, the Juliet Low home is in Savannah, and the national organization owns that one. But we had an opportunity I was the property manager, and we had 5 sites. Our biggest site was right up here. It was called Tycochi, and it's up as you go toward DeLeon Springs. When you're there at the intersection, if you turn left, you go somewhere else. If you turn right, you went to Tycochi. It's now a Boy Scout camp. The problem with it was a man lived on the far side of it, and he had to come through our property to get to his property. And it was a hazard, really. I mean, his trucks and his cars, he had some sort of a farm back there. And so we sold that property while I worked for Citrus Council and bought a piece in Chuliota, a big 250-acre piece that it just happened to come on the market with a spring-fed lake all the way around it, and it's still our major recreation site. We were in downtown Winter Park, and while I was there, they began looking for another piece of property, and we found one. One of the real estate people called, and he said, "You've got to come look at this building. It's made for you." And it was on Mills Avenue, after Mills crossed Colonial, down on the left-hand side, a 2-story building, but the bottom was not, it was just wide open. You parked under it. So it was up on stilts, and you could drive right underneath the whole building. And so I went back and I told my boss, I said, "It's going to be a perfect building for us, but we need to do some remodeling." So she left it up to me. We closed off the bottom, almost all of the bottom, and put in our store and a print shop. And then the upper half was the offices, and they're still there today.
Yeah, that's a beautiful building. I've seen it.
It's a gorgeous building. That's my building.
Yeah.
I got to do that building.
You did great work, Sally, great work in so many ways.
Well, it's because it just fell in my hands. It was fun jobs.
Yes. Well, and I like the fact that children have been a theme throughout your life.
Well,
working with children, all different ages, and you just have given them so much of yourself.
All the way from infants to teenagers.
Right. What was I meant to ask you this before, but what was the youngest child that you had in your daycare?
6 weeks. That was a little tiny baby, a little tiny baby.
So I wanted to ask you about your pets. I know you love cats very much.
Cats, but we had dogs too.
Yeah, tell me about when you were growing up, your pets that you had.
We had a big, first we had Trixie. Trixie moved with us from Michigan. She was a little fox terrier, and she was probably, way into old age when she passed away. And then my dad said, "That's enough of dogs." And we got a cat, whose name was Meow. Somebody. But along came this little stray black and white dog. It was a puppy, and my dad was at work, and we were at home. Well, we gave him a bath, and we fed him, and by the time my dad got home, there wasn't any getting rid of that dog. And my sister Sandy named him. His name was Rip, R.I.P. She said, "He's going to rest in peace at our house." And Rip was, oh my gosh, we had Rip till he was probably 18 or 19 years old. Trixie and Rip at the same time.
Right. Well, and tell us where you live now.
I live in Deltona. I didn't think I would ever live in Deltona. I like DeBary, and I inherited my dad's house, and I had my own house, but a house became available that I really liked. My friend was a beautician. She lived in Deltona, one of the first residents, and she had a beauty shop in DeBary. And she decided to sell her house and get another one. And she called me up and I said, don't sell it. Let me come in and look at it. And I looked at it and I said, see if I can buy it. And I did.
But it's on a special lake.
Well, it's on a special lake that I didn't know. I'm on a spring-fed lake that's 100 feet deep in Deltona.
What's the name of it?
The name, Deltona named it Lake Baton.
B-A-T-O-N.
B-A-T-O-N, wave your baton. That's not Lake Baton. That's the lake we pedaled our bikes out to when we were kids and swam in it. And it was called Evans Lake. And one time when I was walking around the lake, they had started a new development on the backside. There was one of those plot maps hung on a post, and I snitched it and took it home. Well, it was a map of Lake Baton, but they had a line drawn straight across it. The bottom half was called Evans Lake, and the top half was Baton Lake. Evans Lake was where Norma Evans, who was a friend of more of my sisters than mine, lived in Enterprise. She was right between my sister and me. And her father was kind of a hermit, and he lived out there while Norma and her mother lived in Enterprise. And she used to come out there in the summer, and we would ride our bikes through an old dirt trail. You would go down High Banks Road, and it dead-ended at Enterprise, and then wandered around this little trail out to Evans Lake, and we swam there. When I got that map and spread it on my dining room table and looked at it and saw that it said 11th, I called up Norma and I said, Norma, I'm living on your lake. And she came over to see it. And now it's known as Lake Baton. I don't know where they got that, but it's still a spring-fed lake. And, you know, a spring-fed lake in Florida doesn't fluctuate. It doesn't go down, way down when it's just a little puddle and then way up when it rains. It comes up a little bit when it rains, but never floods or anything like that. And it's nice, fresh. I took water samples in, and it's drinking water pure. Yeah.
And you were telling me about what the city of DeBary did, Deltona did to it. It wasn't very nice.
I live one block off of Saxon Boulevard, which is a main drive through, and they decided that they needed to put in a retention pond to take the water off of Saxon Boulevard. So it's about 2 blocks up from me and over is a huge retention pond. Well, what did they do with the retention pond as it overflowed? They piped it underground into my lake. And we'll still get oil slicks on the top. I protested it. I went to every meeting and everything. And now I don't think today they would be able to do that. But they did back at the time. And right now there's a right-of-way right down to the lake where the water pours in. And you can see it when it's a heavy rainstorm. It's bubbling right outside my window.
Well, based on your own experience, what advice would you give to a young person today? And I know you have given a lot of advice to young people in your life.
Lots
there's
of
some
advice.
like little.
I guess the main thing I would tell them was
you have
find something that you like, get a good job, and stick with it.
That's good advice. And how would you like to be remembered?
Oh, dear me. Let's see, as this old bat who ran a nursery school and a daycare, or this old bat who worked for the grocery store, the Girl Scouts. I don't know. Maybe that I was fun. I like kids.
Definitely love children.
And I see them today, which is so neat. I mean, they've grown up and had families of their own. I run into people all the time, and they've got children and some grandchildren. And they'll say, Miss Sally, don't you remember me? I thought, how the heck can I remember you, you snot-nosed little 3-year-old, and now look at you. And I see them all over. A lot of them have stayed in the area. Well, the neatest thing was I was stopped at a roadblock in North Carolina, and we had to wait while they were doing something. I don't know. And I got out of the car, and we were walking around. And this guy got out of the car in front of me, and he started walking back, and he looked at me, and he said, Miss Sally, is that you? And it was one of my kids up there, grown up with 3 children, and they had a summer home in North Carolina.
Small world.
Isn't it? Yeah. Yep, right there. So we stood up. I didn't care how long it took them to fix the road. We stood there for a long time talking.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for this interview. It was delightful, and I know a lot of people will enjoy it.
I hope so.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for asking me.
Well, the West Volusia Historical Society asked you,
Oh, they did?
Really?
Okay, well,
but
I connect you with them.
I was excited about getting to interview you.
Okay.